We have special guests today, which I would like to introduce. First of all, we have, of course, Councillor Bannon. Everybody knows Councillor Bannon is here. We have Morris Smith, who's going to be running for the councillor's job in this council here. Ward.
I didn't know that.
Then we have Cheryl Shindruk. Cheryl, do you want to come up with Neil? Cheryl Shindruk is the senior or executive vice president of Geranium Homes. And Dr. Neil Hutchinson is considered the top limnologist in Ontario. Now, what that means is basically the study of inland lakes, waters, rivers, and all things water. So what happened was when Geranium came to us about the Copperstone development and everything else like that, and we had some discussions with the residents and we addressed all the concerns, and we had Geranium get back to us. The long and the short of it is, out of these numerous conversations, Mario, who is the top guy with Geranium, said, what can we do for the lake? And we said, well, we've always wanted to know what's going on with the lake, to get a proper study and what have you. We've had some preliminary stuff, but not a really in-depth study. So he says, how about if I get you the top limnologist in Ontario? Would that help? And I said, yeah, but who's going to pay for him? So Geranium, as part of their development and everything, agreed to pick up Neil's tab for this, which is just fabulous on part of Geranium. And did you want to add anything here, Cheryl? Okay, come on. Cheryl Shindruk.
Thank you, Rick. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Geranium. I want to commend Councillor Bannon and Rick Wigmore and the Musselman's Lake Association for being leaders, taking care of this very important community asset, obviously important to all of you here this morning. And it was our pleasure to sponsor Dr. Hutchinson's work. We're going to hear a little bit about that now, but this work, I'm sure, will take this community into the future in terms of caring for this, for the beautiful lake. So thank you for having me this morning, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Rick. It's really nice to be here, see how many people were out. I passed on the road coming in, cleaning things up, and doing a great job for Earth Day. And just a reminder that every day is Earth Day. Put on my Don Cherry voice there. I grew up in Richmond Hill, and when I was 10 years old, I first heard of Musselman's Lake, and I thought that's where strong people lived, and that was shown this morning by all the stuff you were hauling out. That's great. Anyways, about a year ago this time, Cheryl came to me and Mario and talked about the concerns they'd heard at Musselman's Lake from the residents, and that people were concerned that there might be too many weeds or there might be too much algae, and people had heard of some magic solutions that you can do for lakes that can make them better. And we talked about it for a bit and said, well, I don't go to the drugstore and get a prescription without a note from my doctor saying why I need it. And so we agreed that the best thing to do would be to look at the lake and do a good characterization study of what Musselman's Lake is like. It's nice that Rick says I'm a top limnologist of Ontario. What it means is I have good staff. And Dr. Tammy Karst-Riddoch led this study for me, and but she let me come out today to talk to it. Now, Musselman's Lake is a kettle lake. Kettle lakes, they're fairly numerous along the Oak Ridges Moraine, and they were formed when big chunks of ice broke off the glaciers about 8,000 years ago, when the glaciers retreated and were covered by all the till and the soil running off the melting glaciers. And then so there was a big chunk of ice that melted and left a pretty rectangular hole in the ground. And so there's a series of these pockmarked along here. Rick mentioned Preston Lake, we have Wilcox Lake, there's Jefferson Lake, there's Teapot Lake and Brampton. So a lot of these lakes are deep, but not really deep, and a lot of them tend to have similar characteristics. They have lots of groundwater going into them. There's not a lot of surface water. I know if you go down to the outlet in the northwest corner, you'll see that there's rarely, except this time of year, much water going out of Musselman's Lake. A lot of groundwater comes in, and they tend to have certain characteristics. They tend to be a bit warm. They tend to have good weed communities. and they lose their oxygen in the bottom waters in the middle of the summer every year because they're not deep enough to have a lot of oxygen held in. Right now, the ice has just come off the lake, and the lake is pretty much the same temperature, top to bottom, and every bit of wind gets the lake moving and circulating and bringing oxygen down into the bottom waters from the surface. And so the whole lake is one pretty uniform mass right now of oxygen. In June or July, if it ever warms up this spring, the lake is going to stratify. The upper layers warm up and they become less dense as they get warmer, and they don't mix well with the bottom waters. So around about mid-June, we'll have two lakes, where there's one lake now. We'll have a lake up at the top, which is well mixed and lit by the sun, and a small part of the lake called the hypolimnion at the bottom that has a very little bit of oxygen in it that's got to get it through till next November when the lake will mix again. So that oxygen will be used up by decomposing plant matter, and we'll lose our oxygen in the bottom of the lake. And all the oxygen that's there now is all it's got to get it through. So that's natural. That's a natural phenomenon in lakes of about this depth. Lake Wilcox does it too. But it has implications for how the lake behaves. It puts more nutrients into the lake, and certain algae can take advantage of those high nutrients at the bottom. So all these kind of things you have to understand about a lake. So we started sampling last July, and we want to thank Rick for facilitating access to the lake. He took us out on his boat to show us around the first time, showed us how to get our boats in and out of the lake to sample. We went out 5 times between July and October, and once this February as well. And we collected water samples. We measured temperature and oxygen from the top to the bottom. We took samples of water to see what kinds of algae were growing in the lake. And in August, we went out and measured what kinds of rooted plants were growing in the lake as well. And so we put all this together in our report to Rick and to Cheryl. So what did we learn? We learned that actually Musselman's Lake is in very good shape. The province says that lakes like this should have less than 20 parts per billion of phosphorus. Phosphorus is a plant nutrient. It makes your grass green, it makes algae green. It's the limiting nutrient in all the lakes around here. The Ministry of the Environment says there shouldn't be more than 20, or you start risking algal blooms. Well, we have about 17 in the surface waters of Musselman's Lake. It's in good shape. Phosphorus comes in naturally, falls in the rain, blows in as dust, runs off the watershed. It also comes in from our septic systems, from the fertilizers on our lawns, from geese poop, all kinds of different sources. If you get too much phosphorus, your lake will turn green and unpleasant. And we didn't see that this year. We saw a lake that had nice clean water, usually about 4 meters of visibility throughout the lake. We analyzed the algae community. We found that blue-green algae, they're called cyanobacteria. They're toxic when they're in high concentrations in certain species, but they are about where they should be. 10 or 15% of the algal community was made up of these algae, and they're the ones we're worried about. And they're the ones that you hear about harmful algal blooms. It's usually blue-green algae. But Musselman's Lake was well balanced in its algal community. We didn't see problems with that. We found that there's a very good growth of aquatic weeds, aquatic plants out there. Certainly they're thick in some areas, but they're taking their nutrients from the sediments, and they're balanced. There is an invasive plant in here called the Eurasian water milfoil. It's one with little red tips on it and finely feathered. And it's an invasive plant. It can sometimes take over a lake and become very, very prolific, impede anybody using the lake properly. But it seems to be in check in Musselman's Lake. There's 7 or 8 other plants of kind of equal diversity. It tends to be heavier in the 3 to 4 meter depth zone is where we saw a lot of the milfoil. So it's there, but it's not there in troublesome amounts. The other thing is that lakes can have 2 kind of steady states. You can have lakes with lots of rooted plants and clear water because they're competing with the algae for the nutrients in the water. If in fact you take all the plants away, then the algae would get all the nutrients, and you'd have a more turbid water, which is not very pleasant either. So Musselman's Lake seems to be pretty well balanced between the 2. So we don't know if maybe 2013 was just a great year. We do know from reading past records, going back to the 80s, too much chloride is a problem for aquatic life. 12 years ago, the federal government declared road salt a hazardous substance and did a whole series of studies on it, developed water quality objectives for how much was safe, and are been encouraging ways to keep salt out of our water since then, such as switching from rock salt to brine or salt or sand on our roads, which has been done around here. But we are concerned that the chloride's a bit high, and but we don't know if it's increasing or decreasing. The sources could be road salting. They could be a brine from our water softeners going through our septic systems and moving into the lake. They could be the salt that we sprinkle on our sidewalks and our driveways when it gets icy. And we're going to see more icy periods with climate change. We can expect more incidents like last December. And it might just be what the region's using on their roads getting into the groundwater. It's not high enough to be dangerous, but it is higher than we expected. And so it's something that should be looked at from time to time in the future. And maybe that's the way to finish what I'm saying is, what do we want to do next? By and large, the shoreline is well looked after. We don't see a lot of manicured lawns going right down to the lake. That's a good thing. Manicured lawns encourage geese. They just walk right up from the water onto the lawn and then poop on your lawn. There's bacteria and nutrients associated with that. So people should be encouraging to plant vegetation right up to the shoreline, the first 3 meters along the shore. Let it grow up to about this high. It doesn't impede your view, but it keeps the geese off your lawn, keeps the nutrients out of the water. We had a good checkup last year. That should be repeated every couple of years. We should go back and check, and same as we go to the doctor regularly, you should have your lake looked at regularly. It may not have to be as an extensive program as we did last summer, but certain elements of water chemistry should be looked at periodically. And we should just be encouraging to do the right things and not over-fertilize our lawns. Take our lawns back from the water's edge, keep the vegetation there, and enjoy the wildlife that we see out there. And maybe the last thing to say is that a lake is not a swimming pool. A lake is not the Caribbean. A lake in southern Ontario is not a lake in Muskoka. Musselman's Lake is always going to have algae in it. It's always going to have plants in it. And that's just part of the balance and what makes it the type of lake that it is. So I don't know if there's anything else to say other than thanks to Cheryl and Geranium for helping us and helping you. And thanks to Rick for being such a good host. And with that, maybe I'll just give each of them a copy of our report. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be hanging around for a while. Thank you.
As you can see, it seems like the lake is in balance. It's amazing how sometimes when you don't interfere with nature, nature does an amazing job for you. And like I was saying to Dr. Hutchinson, when you contrast it with, I believe it was Wilcox or Preston, which was it that put the aerator on? Wilcox put an aerator on the lake. It was supposed to do a lot of stuff. And they ended up with a red bloom, and they ended up with nothing but trouble. The amazing thing is that we don't interfere with this lake too much, and we've got probably the best lake in the system. Neil says we got to check all the other systems to make sure that statement is correct, but from what I've read on the internet, a lot of these other lakes have had problems that we just haven't run into. Now, at this time, we've got another exciting, so again, Dr. Hutchinson will be around if you got any questions for him. Basically, I asked him too about the algae that we've got going on right now. Well, as you can see, we have no rooted plants because, of course, they all died in the wintertime. So we're going to monitor that and see how it goes. Once the rooted plants grow, we should see the algae go back to nothing again. And then we'll repeat the cycle in the fall.